Hi everyone, welcome. I am Daniel Domingues, Associate Professor of African History at Rice University and Director of Undergraduate Studies of the Center for Africa and African American Studies. It is my pleasure to welcome you today for a talk with Professor Christel from Literary Pan-Africanism to Black Cultural Mythology, Reading Exile as a Memory of Phenomenon. And to start, we're going to have Professor Elias Bongmba from the Department of Religious Studies to introduce Dr. Temple. Dr. Bongmba, please.
Thank you, Professor Domingues. I am very excited to welcome Professor Temple to the center and to Rice. Professor Temple earned her PhD in African American Studies from Temple University. Her major fields of interest are Africana Cultural Memory Studies, Comparative Africana Literature, Black Nationalism, Pan-Africanism and Afroeuropean Studies. She's a leading scholar of Black thought and the larger Africana world. She is author of 4 highly acclaimed books on literature, mythology, and cultures of the Black world. And that's not a small feat because she covers a whole area of what we call the Black world. She has a forthcoming collection on Muhammad Ali in African Cultural Memory, co-authored with James Conyers. And here I want to note that we extend our sympathy to Dr. Temple for the homegoing of Professor Conyers, who until his recent death was the director of the African and African American Studies program at the University of Houston. An amazing scholar, one of the gentlest souls in academia that I know of. Temple's recent book, Black Cultural Mythology, which she just won a prize, takes Black cultural literary criticism to a new level, arguing that these studies, the narratives, the ideas of Black cultures and mythologies offer a rigorous theoretical methodology. She also goes ahead and executes not only that theory, but a very impressive dissection of the engagement that these literary scholars have brought to the world. It is a bold work, a work that will remain engaging in the scholarly world for a very long time. And so without much ado, we are delighted to welcome her again to Rice and the Center and look forward to hearing what Professor Temple has to tell us. Thank you so much for being here, Professor Temple.
There we go. You're very welcome. Thank you very much, Professor Bongmba. Thank you, Professor Domingues. Thank you, tech support, John and Eric. Thank you so much. It is a pleasure to be here, and I'm going to dive right in. Okay. There we go with my PowerPoint. Okay, so from literary Pan-Africanism to Black cultural mythology, reading exile as a memory phenomenon. Slides, oh, there we go. Okay, so I'm going to start by just posting a few definitions. Exile, memory, mythology. I'm very much okay with the Webster's dictionary definitions, but I just want to point out that in terms of mythology, a lot of times when we think of mythology, we think of there are multiple definitions, but we think of the definition that would send us to thinking about Greek mythology, about the made-up creation stories that explain phenomena that humans, have questions about. And it's more than that. And so mythology can be legendary activity elevated to cyclical storytelling. And so that reinforces an actual historical occurrences. And so I published the monograph, Literary Pan-Africanism, History, Context, and Criticism in 2005. Literary Pan-Africanism is a framework of literary criticism that is useful for analyzing texts that present migration from the diaspora back to Africa. And so my core work on the topic is attentive to understanding the meaning of when African writers create African American characters in their text. The framework encourages us to be attentive to the author's historical biographical context. So in this case, it would mean learning if the African author has traveled to the United States, if the author has interacted with African Americans anywhere, if this form of cross-cultural characterization is an isolated or repeated or well-developed aspect of the writer's full corpus of literary production, and if the unity, cooperation, and mutual identification, or the Pan-Africanism, if the Pan-Africanism revealed in the text is aligned with the traditional or contemporary Pan-African practices or ideals. And so then 15 years later, I published the monograph Black Cultural Mythology in 2020. Black cultural mythology is an expansion of the Black arts movement's concept of mythology, which is one of the 7 criteria of culture, the expansion of this concept into a conceptual framework that is an Africana studies contribution to the field of Africana Cultural Memory Studies. And so how many times have we assigned Larry Neal's 1968 essay, the Black arts movement, to our students? We'd have them recite and fill out on exams the 7 criteria of culture. Mythology is the first one, and yet it's sitting there kind of untheorized, unapplied, and we'll get to that in a moment. But also, let's talk about Africana Cultural Memory Studies. And so in Africana Studies, we have a lot of cross-listing. A Black topic course in English or psychology or history is thought to be Africana Studies. And so in reverse, I'm actually defining Africana Cultural Memory Studies, which is the last chapter in Black cultural mythology. It's called Introducing Africana Cultural Memory Studies, because I've studied and seen all of the memory work that's kind of scattered in the field. And my attempt has been to gather this into a unified subfield of Africana Cultural Memory Studies. And so I even have created a course at the University of Pittsburgh on Africana Cultural Memory Studies, and I'd like one too on Black cultural mythology. And so Black cultural mythology is a conceptual framework. As a conceptual framework, it proposes that the African diaspora experiences of beginning again and engraving identity on new soil, that they reflect memory making. And so beginning again is not my term. I've borrowed it from Malefikete Asante's work. In his 1980 book, Afrocentricity, he proposes that that African people in the United States, for starters, but it would go to the diaspora too, which might have different dates, but he proposed that we begin to date ourselves in terms of beginning again. And so if we identify time, he has ABA, that we would say we are, our culture is so and so many years old. Like in 2019, it'd be 400 years old, ABA, which after beginning again in 1619. And so he prioritizes that year for English North America. The engraving identity on new soil, I borrow the language of engraving identity from the French sociologist Maurice Holbach, who deals with collective memory. But I thought that was just really powerful. And it's a nod to much of the work that has been done prior to my conceptual framework of Black cultural mythology. And so these diaspora experiences of beginning again and engraving identity on new soil reflect memory making. So in essence, what we recall and narrate about our heroic survival in our history, in our heritage, in our plight, sustains self-esteem, it sustains confidence, it sustains inspirational, our attention to inspirational cultural prowess that has enabled our permanence and our striving within the diaspora against incredible odds. And so think Harriet Tubman, think the Haitian Revolution, and some other things. And so we need these stories, these narratives, these cyclical reminders of our heroic and legendary activity to continue surviving and thriving. And so Black psychologist Amos and Wilson would call this mythological structure. And so I want to reinforce that Black cultural mythology is one configuration of the broader Africana cultural memory studies. And it's evolved out of Africana studies, really formal disciplinary thinking. And so the challenge we have is that a lot of the works in Africana cultural memory or in cultural memory studies prioritize the trauma of enslavement, and the intervention here, as all of our works exist together kind of as this repertoire for cultural memory studies, is that Black cultural mythology focuses on surviving enslavement and this narrative storytelling about heroic prowess that comes in that storytelling. And so for this evening's talk, I'm sharing a revelation that I had a couple of years ago when I began the self-assessment that comes with the process of applying for full professor. This revelation was also supported by an invitation to write the introductory essay for the section on literary Pan-Africanism that is included in the Routledge Handbook of Pan-Africanism that came out last year in 2020, edited by Raylan Rabaka. And so the revelation is that the topical seed of exile that kind of jump-started my journey into researching the West African vision of the African-American experience is actually a part of the Africana cultural memory phenomenon. And so as scholars, we tend to assess our work. And so for a while, I was saying to myself, okay, literary Pan-Africanism, that was my first wave of scholarship. And now I do Black culture mythology. And I was thinking of them as separately, but it occurred to me that they are kind of two different sides of the same coin. So in my master's degree program in comparative Black literature, and that was the only available track in an African American studies department at the University of Maryland, Baltimore County, we studied the concept of exile quite a bit. And so South African apartheid had been a more recent phenomenon. This is mid-90s, and thinkers such as the self-exiled Ezekiel Mfahele and Dennis Brutus were on my radar. Wole Soyinka, Nigerian Wole Soyinka, and his 2 bouts of political exile were also regular topics of discussion. And I became familiar with his notes from imprisonment, from The Man Died, Prison Notes of Wole Soyinka from 1971. And so I was attentive to this line of thinking, which was also supported by reading Kwame Nkrumah's works in our Africana Studies Sociopolitical Thought course, in which after Ghanaian independence, he welcomed diasporans back home to return from the exile imposed on us by enslavement and by hundreds of years of displacement. So in one critical framework, diaspora people have been exiled from Africa, and the corrective for this was the various back to Africa ideas and opportunities over hundreds of years, actually, several hundreds of years, that allowed returns. And so toward the end of my program, I happed upon 2 plays by a Ghanaian writer, Ama Ata Adu, titled Dilemma of a Ghost, published in 1965, and Anawa, published in 1970. And this cemented my objective to study the diaspora separation from Africa as a philosophical form of exile. And so Adu's 2 plays seek to force Africans, and I think her audience is broader. It's Africans, it's African Americans, it's others who want to read in terms of literature and drama, but she forced us to recall the original point of separation of Africa's people and then to regenerate kinship. And so one of my mentors, historian Ella Forbes, she influenced my shift from the term exile, the topic of exile, to the phrasing of the African vision of the African American experience. However, exile is linked to idea formation that supports an inquiry into cultural memory and cultural mythology. So in Dilemma of a Ghost fulfilled that burning question posed by Lorraine Hansberry's play, A Raisin in the Sun from 1959. And you can see from this picture, that question was, oh my gosh, what would happen if Beneath the Younger married the Nigerian Joseph Asagai and then moved back to Africa with him? And so, you know, in the story, Beneath the Younger, they're moving up out of kind of living in tenement housing. They're waiting on an insurance check. They want to move to the suburbs, but she's kind of this newer generation. She's attending college. She's taking courses like horseback riding and guitar and other things that you usually don't stereotypically associate with African Americans, but it's the opportunities you see in college. But she also has 2 suitors. And so one is Murchison and the other one is Asagai, the Nigerian student, and they kind of vie for her attention. And so indeed, the play, A Dilemma of a Ghost, Christina Ama Ata Adu's play, it's an African, in it there's a character named Eula Lee. She's an African-American woman and she meets an African man named Atto Yawson in college in the United States. They get married in the United States and then relocate to Ghana to meet and then live among his traditional family. And so the play is really interesting. It's entertaining. It does not go well at all, but the dilemma is resolved at the very end. The couple seems to be headed for divorce as Eula Lee ponders returning to the United States. At some point, she mentions or it comes out that she's an orphan. And so it's her husband's grandmother who learns that Eula Lee's mother is deceased, therefore an ancestor, even as an African-American ancestor, And she conceptually shifts now to now view Eulalie as a daughter for whom she is bound by ancestral links to be responsible and to assist in this time of cultural need and reintegration back to life, Black into life on African soil. And so the play Anawa is about a girl who worries, she's young, she worries her family to death with requests to learn about her society's participation in the enslavement trade. And so for her community, it's something they did in the past, but it still is existing in Africa during the context of the play. Anawa rejects the husband chosen for her, marries someone else who's a businessman, and then it turns out that he is participating in the sale of enslaved Africans. And so it's a scenario, enslavement is a scenario that haunts her dreams as a prophetic warning, but her community never talks about it. And so from Ama Ata'adu's text, there's confirmation of this. They say, no one talks of these things anymore. All good men and women try to forget, they have forgotten. And so literary critic Ebele Eko pairs a study of Anawa with Kiswana from Gloria Naylor's The Women of Brewster Place, a novel, noting that both women give a warning not to forget their roots, nor the bridge over which they have passed, that human bond and link to Mother Africa that makes them a people. And so Anawa's family and countrymen have, in a sense, exiled or purged or sequestered knowledge of the enslavement trade from the culture's discourses. And so Adu, in her writing as a dramatist, she repeats forms of the word forget, forgot, forgotten. The opposite of memory or the opposite of remembering is forgetting. Thus, these literary scenarios of exile do interrogate a memory phenomenon. And so in a shift now, I would like to walk us through some of the critical observations about from African intellectuals, from writers, from activists, as well as African-American returnees and scholars who have processed the psychology and expectations of using the return in a very Sankofic sense to reconcile such exile. And so we all know, I think we all know, the Adinkra philosophy of Sankofa means return to the source. It means go back and fetch it. It means it is not taboo to go back and retrieve that which was lost. And so this is a philosophy that is a corrective to forms of exile. So recollection or memory or retrieval of memory, all of these are related phenomena. So we see exile as a memory adjacent phenomenon. And so Ama Ata'adu contextualizes her concerns with bridging the separation, which is what she does in her writing. She says, and this is a longer quote, she says, maybe it's because I come from a people from whom, for some reason, the connection with African America or the Caribbean was a living thing. Something of which we were always aware. She says in Nkrumah's Ghana, one met with African Americans and people from the Caribbean. In my father's house, we were always getting visitors from all over. I think that the whole question of how it was that so many of our people could be enslaved and sold is very, very important. I've always thought that this is an area that must be probed. It probably holds one of the keys to our future. And so that's Ama Ata'adu presenting this consciousness as a writer, and her fiction functions to make others who did not have such a Black international household experience in their development, it functions to make them aware of the matters of exile and reconciliation that are being processed in returns back to Africa. And so another Nigerian, Wole Soyinka, frames a challenge this way, and I think this has got to be among one of my most popular quotes. And so he writes, he says, what other race, and especially on the African continent, has lost 200 million of its people through forcible uprooting? Elementary curiosity justifies that we seek out those who have survived of that number and inquire, in what forms have they survived? What have they achieved? What have they contributed to their new environments? What lessons, if any, have their specific genius evolved for those who were left behind? The human and African habit of celebration, which is an act of recollection, assessment, and rededication validates this impulse. This is a wonderful quote because Soyinka provides a host of memory adjacent variables to deal with the history of forcible uprooting or exile, including in this inquiry. And so when we think about recollection and assessment and the habit of celebration, it really relates to a lot of the variables in Black cultural mythology that include commemoration, that include ancestral acknowledgement, that include heroic survival. And so next we have a slightly different take on this. And this comes from South African Ezekiel Mfahele. And he observes, he says, although Afro-American intellectuals have tried since the turn of the century to reach out to Africa, there is little evidence that independent Africa has had either the energy or the psychological need to come across to study the Afro-American. He continues, Africans cherish an ancient cultural heritage on their own soil, whereas the Blacks here have always been searching for a base. And so this observation is interesting because it presupposes that diasporans have nothing in their 400+ year tradition that is as grounding for them as the ancient cultural heritage is for Africans who remained in Africa on their own soil. And so just to kind of sneak peek or advance notice, I disagree with this reference. It's from the early 80s. And so this is coming from an archival conversation about what return and exile can mean. But I disagree with the reference, and Black cultural mythology, though, is precisely the framework that allows us to seek out the diasporic traditions of cultural memory, myth, heroics, mythology, commemoration, and documentations of hyperheroic prowess and survival based on our own narratives. And so this comment is an aside to kind of prepare us for what's coming next with some of the additional slides. So in this view, reaching out and searching are considered to be diasporic investigative acts or behaviors that seek documentation of their existence in African homeland memory to counter exile and to reconcile this legacy of separation fostered by the enslavement trade. And so the return is a type of healing. And so this reconciliation is often a ritual of return or visiting the forts along the coast, such as Cape Coast or Elmina, to view with one's own diasporic eyes the site of exile. And so scholars such as historian Ana Lucia Araujo refer to these in her work, Shadows of the Slave Past from 2014. She refers to these as sites of deportation, sites of disembarkation, and she even addresses sites of labor in Brazil and the United States. And so I call this a site of exile to differentiate the shift that I see from, and this is where the slide hopefully will explain this a bit, the shift that I see from kind of Africa-based heritage memory as a needed or a desired reconciliation that responds to being in exile versus Africana cultural memory, or Black cultural mythology, which is a diaspora-based inventory of what we have achieved in creating culture, which is a new way of life based on how each successive generation has chosen to interact on new soil, how we've created a culture and what we have achieved by transmitting this new culture as new memory to future generations within the diaspora. And so I hope this slide helps to look at some of the different, helps us to view some of the differences and priorities. And so writers play a major part in this transmission, as do historians, as do filmmakers and documentary and nonfiction such as autobiography. And so let's shift a bit. Maya Angelou has a significant, we all know Maya Angelou, the poet, the speaker, the memoirist, the dancer, the performer, the singer, all of these wonderful things that she's left us in her legacy. Part of this legacy is that she has a significant set of observations about the reconciliation of exile in her memoir, All God's Children Need Traveling Shoes, which was published in 1986, but it represents an experience in her life that is about 20 years old. And so her emotional descriptions alert us to exactly what is at stake in the need to reconcile exile and to learn if Africa has any memory of diasporic people. So in 1962, she stopped in Ghana on her way from Cairo, headed to Liberia, but she stopped in Ghana to get her son settled in college at the University of Ghana, Accra. And days before classes begin, he was in a car accident and he broke his neck. The distraught mother remained in Ghana for the duration of his long recovery, and then remained there even longer through 1966, working and performing there. 1965, working and performing there. So her observations express the yearnings of an exile, but also, again, the language reveals memory adjacent terms. And so her observations are very interesting. And I'm going to walk us through some of these and explain them. And so one thing she said, well, to many Africans, only whites could be strangers. All Africans belong somewhere to some clan. And so she writes this in her memoir, hopeful that Africa will embrace or recognize her, at least because of her skin color. And so I'll give you a tidbit too. The memoir has a really great ending where, after all of this searching and these, I guess, insecure expressions that I'm about to review that she shares, she is recognized based on her height and her physical features, and has a sense of closure, a sense of peace when she leaves Ghana, that she is a part of Africa. In another instance, she has a petty conflict in an office with a Ghanaian secretary. And this secretary says, "American Negroes are always crude." And Maya Angelou is taken aback. And so she says her knowledge of my people could only have been generated from hearsay. And so in this instance, the exile is not welcomed, but is scorned. And so we can imagine Maya Angelou shows us that the return is quite an emotional experience. She then questions, she says, had what we judged as racial prejudice less to do with race and more to do with our particular ancestors' bad luck at having been caught, sold, and driven like beasts? And so again, in these insecure moments of not being embraced the way she expects to, she examines the possibility or the revelation that her ancestors had bad luck or ill fortune or a deficit even to get caught. She continues, and this is a powerful one. She says, our people have always longed for home. For centuries, we had sung about a place not built with hands, where the streets were paved with gold and were washed with honey and milk. In the yearning, heaven and Africa were inextricably combined. And so here she documents the African-American kind of vernacular tradition, the spiritual tradition, where there is yearning for home, for a heritage home, while in the location of exile. And this yearning kind of interrupts the totality of 100% peace for some Africans. And so she continues, and she says, she was drinking alcohol. She says, I drank and admitted to a boundless envy of those who remained on the continent out of fortune. Their countries have been exploited and their cultures have been discredited by colonialism. Nonetheless, they could reflect through their priests and chiefs on centuries of continuity. The lowliest could call the names of ancestors who lived centuries earlier. The land upon which they lived had been in their people's possession beyond remembered time. And so we can kind of see her. I mean, these are separate quotes from different parts of her memoir, where she's still trying to figure out her place and her place in Africa. And so she cites envy, desire, jealousy, a sense of unfairness or inequity, that Africa has formal remembrances and continuity. But that does not mean that the diaspora has nothing. Here, Angelou's commentary is more attentive to the deficit of exile loss rather than to the asset of what diasporic people have created in the process of beginning again and engraving identity on new soil. And so the conceptual framework of Black cultural mythology intervenes to redirect this type of deficit analysis, and the 15 attributes, which you'll see here on the color wheel, my son calls it a color wheel, on the radial chart. The 15 attributes really expand the possibilities of what cultural memory can mean for diaspora people. So in the context of the return, the matter of home emerges. Wole Soyinka called his exile a political sabbatical. I don't think we can call the enslavement exile the same thing, but of exile, he writes, when in exile, you see the situation in your home from the outside and get even angrier. You see how people elsewhere are allowed to be creative, to be logical, progressive, and you think, why can't things be the same? And so Soyinka speaks of home, which to him is Nigeria, but Angelou also speaks of home, which is not the United States. She describes Africa as a home which had shamefully little memory of its transported enslaved descendants. And then she laments, she says, which one of us could know that years of bondage, brutalities, the mixture of other bloods, customs, and language had transformed us into an unrecognizable tribe. And so again, these are memory adjacent terms that appear in a conversation about responding to exile. And so here we have recognition, we have home and memory in terms of Africa's memory of African Americans. And so here I will shift to discuss Black cultural mythology as a second wave, a different orientation to the exile loss model, attentive to our title, From Literary Pan-Africanism to Black Cultural Mythology. And so in Literary Pan-Africanism, cross-cultural questions are lurking. And these questions are, do you remember me? Africa, do you remember me? Do you recognize me? Have you missed me? Do you remember when my people or my lineage lived here too? Is that why you wrote about me in your novels and plays, to help me and other diasporans move beyond our legacy of exile and separation? Do you remember me, Africa? And so that's what we see embodied in what Maya Angelou presents. But the new questions from a Black cultural mythology perspective are about, and based on these 15 attributes here, it's about wait. Do you mean that if I mine African American and the diasporic archive of cultural and socio-political thought and literature, that I will discover that we have a tradition of cultural memory that highlights our own indigenous, organic, diasporic created ideas about memory, myth, mythology, immortalization, commemoration, ancestral acknowledgement, sacred observance, sacrificial inheritance, hyperheroics, epic intuitive conduct, resistance-based cognitive survival, hero dynamics, and aesthetic memorialization. And so these are the attributes on here. And so the point is that at the bottom of the slide, from a Black cultural mythology point, in the name of establishing this new subfield of Africana cultural memory, we're saying that, wait a minute, when we dig in the archive and identify our tradition, we can actually find at least 15 additional contexts for what we've been calling memory. And so the search for scholarship on memory has been really frustrating. I can pick up a book that says memory in the title, and memory is only in the title. You don't see it anywhere else in the additional chapters. And so it was really rewarding to do this research, to be able to say this. Wait, do you mean if I mine the African American diasporic tradition, I can discover all of this? And so literary Pan-Africanism, just for to give closure to this comparison, says, Africa, I'm returning from exile. Do you remember me? I need to know that you do in order to have a sense of reconciliation. And I remember traveling to Ghana for the first time. I've been to Ghana and I've been to Egypt. And I do think it's important for me to have gone to travel there. And so the first time I had guaranteed research funds from my job after the PhD, I said, oh, I'm going to Ghana. And that was kind of right away. And so it was important to go. And so Black cultural mythology then says, in a slight contrast, it says, I'm confident about my African heritage and might have even returned to the homeland, but I celebrate the cultural memory of this diaspora place that documents a hard-won survival. And so I'm done with the slides now. I'm going to stop this share and just deliver the rest of my paper. And so the shift here between the two frameworks, heritage memory and African heritage memory and Africana cultural memory as a diaspora phenomenon, there's even more to unpack. And this comes from the research in Black cultural mythology. And so Vincent Odampton, in The Art of Ama-Ata-Adu, Polylectics and Reading Against Neocolonialism, he suggests that Ama-Ata-Adu's character, Eulalie, is unprepared for the humbling and traumatic encounter with her past and possible future upon returning to Africa from exile in the United States and upon seeking to be embraced by Africa. This description is a good signifier to compare what is at stake in exile as a memory phenomenon in the African-based heritage memory of return. So in the diaspora-based cultural memory phenomenon, which does not look back to Africa as a foundation of beginning again and engraving identity on new soil, the stakes are not as high and can be less traumatic. And so it's a matter of domestic discovery, of excavating history, and archiving heroics and achievement that form the basis of a new diaspora-centered celebration and recollection. And so in essence, it's a diaspora-centered, it's a diaspora legacy commemoration. And so you may recognize these as, some of these as Soyinka's words, as he made a plea for reassessing what we have achieved in the diaspora, what we've created to give to the world. And he pairs this with an African curiosity and investigating archival remembrance. So he emerges as a scholar and cultural observer who accounts for both post-exile, Africa-based heritage memory, as well as the diaspora-based creation of a survivalist cultural memory, which is taking inventory of what we have created on diaspora soil. And so in addition, Maya Angelou questions if the return has any value at all. She writes, I doubted if I or any Black from the diaspora could really return to Africa. We wore skeletons of old despair like necklaces heralding our arrival, and we were branded with cynicism. And so this self-pity kind of that she records was also challenged by a thoughtful elder Ghanaian gentleman. He was a servant, I think maybe a janitor at the university where she worked. And so he assured her, he says, look, your people, they from this place, and if this place claims you, or if it does not claim you, here you belong. And so that's a type of affirmation. And so in literary Pan-Africanism, I also trace the return in several other texts, including Ghanaian Aikwe Armah's novels, and the latter links best to, and his novels, particularly his novel Osiris Rising, relates best to the sentiments of belonging after years of exile. And so in Osiris Rising, Armah presents a protagonist. Her name is Aset. She's an African-American Egyptologist. She travels to an African country to kind of join with her boyfriend and work in the struggle, and they try to decipher some secret revolutionary society together, but they're having this casual conversation where he kind of tries to culturally one-up her. And so she tells him, look here. She doesn't say, look here. She says, in the end, my being born in America doesn't make a lot of difference. It means my great-great-grandparents were captured and transported over there. Yours weren't. I prefer not to forget several thousand years of our common history because of a few centuries of separation. And I do this with my class. I love this quote too from his novel, where I do this. I'm like, I choose not to forget thousands of years of a common history because of a few centuries of separation. And so it's really profound that Armah put those words in his African-American protagonist dialogue. And so Aset speaks confidently without loss or emotional baggage of exile. Her retort is empowering. It is an example of the heritage security that does not require affirmation from the homeland. Now, there's no negative critique for diasporans who seek affirmation or who seek a relationship with Africa. However, there is room for both homeland affirmation and for diasporic cultural memory. And so as a newly defined tradition reflecting African-American idea formation related to myth, memory, and heroics, Black cultural mythology provides an additional, more contemporary heritage certainty. And so there is also, I include Haiti in Black cultural mythology, but there has not been room to expand it to the rest of the Caribbean, but it should be a useful tool that applies with limited changing across cultures. And so I want to shift now to talk about what's really in chapter 1 of Black cultural mythology, because it shows us the intellectual foundations of Black cultural mythology. How are we doing for time, Professor Domingues?
We're doing fine. Please go ahead.
Okay. Oh, wait, my clock says 8:09, so I'm up a little. Okay. So, I want to highlight Maria Stewart. We may be familiar with her as this fiery abolitionist speaker. She lived from 1803 to 1879. In my research in identifying which exemplars, which activists, which theorists, which sociopolitical thinkers have really contributed to what we've been able to mine as those 15 attributes of Black cultural mythology, Maria Stewart stood out because she promoted immortalization as a cultural objective. One of my most beloved quotes from her is when she says, "Oh, ye daughters of Africa." And she's saying this from a stage to mixed audiences as the first African female abolitionist speaker to speak to both male and female audiences in Boston in the 1830s. She says, "Oh, ye daughters of Africa, awake, Awake, arise, no longer sleep or slumber, but distinguish yourselves. Show forth to the world that ye are endowed with noble and exalted faculties. O ye daughters of Africa, what have ye done to immortalize your names beyond the grave? What examples have ye set before the rising generation? What foundations have ye laid for generations yet unborn? And so she does that. She also demonstrates an Ebonic use of heroes, where she didn't have a book to pick up to inspire Black families, Black women to say, look what all the women of our culture have done. And so she drew on some European heroes, but she said, what if women as described here shall arise from our sable race? And then finally, she promoted hero dynamics and modeled ancestor acknowledgement. She was a pioneer right along with David Walker. She's often omitted, but also she gathered and collected her own works from the 1830s and published them 44 years later in 1879. So we can even have a record of her speeches. So she kind of did a type of self-memorialization that is really prominent in the study of print culture. And so the next person, we know Frances Ellen Watkins Harper, born in 1825, died in 1911. She did a lot of speaking and had a lot of philosophies about women's uplift. One of her most profound examples related to Black cultural mythology is a teacher that she includes in her novel Iola Leroy. And the teacher is Lucy Delaney, who ends up marrying Iola Leroy's brother. But she says about her children, she says, the student. She says, instead of forgetting the past, I would have them hold in everlasting remembrance our great deliverance. Hitherto, we have never had a country with tender, precious memories to fill our eyes with tears or glad reminiscences to thrill our hearts with pride and joy. We've been aliens and outcasts in the land of our birth, but I want my pupils to do all in their power to make this country worthy of their deepest devotion and loftiest patriotism. And so I'm going to run through the last several quickly, but these emerge as some of the thinkers that help us to reorient our thought toward Black cultural mythology as a framework of Africana cultural memory. And so there's Shirley Graham Du Bois, who published 11 biographies. She did 8 of them in an 8-year, she did 8 of them in 11 years from 1944 to 1955. And then she did 3 more in the 70s. But who knew, when you think of Du Bois's second wife, she traveled with him to Ghana, was there with him when he died. Who knew that she'd written 11 biographies from George Washington Carver, Paul Robeson, Frederick Douglass, Phyllis Wheatley, Benjamin Banneker, Pocahontas, Jean-Baptiste Point de Sable, Booker T. Washington, Julius Nyerere, Du Bois, and even Gamal Abdel Nasser. And so she's another significant kind of foremother of the biography project in capturing a sense of African-American heroics. And so Larry Neal emerges as a really important scholar. Unfortunately, he died in 1981. He's the one who wrote the Black Arts Movement, that major essay or manifesto from 1968. And so we find, although he mentions mythology as the criteria of culture that Maulana Karenga was putting forth, he doesn't give a footnote, but he does credit in that essay that these 7 criteria come from Karenga. He actually has a lot of his own work on mythology. And so if we're familiar with the literary criticism, the Black aesthetic, I think the second essay in there is a really 3-page T-chart of brainstorming, where Larry Neal is kind of planting the seed that I've been able to pick up, decades later to form as Black cultural mythology, where he was toying with terminologies and categories such as mythology, neo-mythology, race memory, meaning and memory, unitary myth, love memory, and even ancestral ghost. Maulana Karenga, we know him much for his work with in creating Kwanzaa, but he emerges when we actually do the study. He's one of the premier scholars on mythology, because in his Kawaida theory, which is a theory of social change for African people, he demarcates between secular and sacred assumptions and constructions which join the human and natural with the supernatural. And he identifies that secular mythology is heroic history and that sacred mythology is known as religion. But he told me he abandoned the use of mythology in his writings, in his theories, because he thought that African Americans were too quickly associated that with Judeo-Christian mythology that we see in the Bible. And so we see a lot of Karenga's writings are some of the purest forms of ancestry acknowledgement, where he often engaged in a type of African-American libation prayer, where he lists the names of people like Malcolm X and Martin Luther King and Elijah Muhammad and Frederick Douglass and Mary McLeod Bethune and Fannie Lou Hamer, who he considers to be the ancestors that kind of fortify the models of the type of prowess we want to have, heroic prowess. In Africana studies, we're challenged to have a knowledge base in multiple subject areas. And so from this, Amos Wilson emerges from his work on cultural memory and mythological structure from his book on the developmental psychology of the Black child. And so in Africa, in the research, he's one of the only ones to really use the word cultural mythology by name, but he talks about the deficit of heroic stories that are passed down in Black families that are frustrated. And he says, let's guard from having parents so frustrated by poverty, by lack of education, that they do not have the skills to pass down legacy information, knowledge in the home to their children so that they can have confidence and high self-esteem. And so he emerges as another exemplar. And so the final example in the intellectual tradition is Malefikete Asante. And so when we hear Asante's name, we immediately think of Afrocentricity. Well, guess what? Before Afrocentricity, it turns out that Malefikete Asante was the premier scholar with the most work on the subject of African-American myth. And this came from his background in rhetoric and communication studies. And so when we look at contemporary Africana cultural memory studies dealing with the African-American experience, we find that scholars turn to Toni Morrison's essay, The Site of Memory, and Rootedness, the Ancestors as Foundation, as their primary theoretical foundations for myth. They don't go back to Larry Neal, they don't go back to mythology, they don't go back to Karenga and his work on mythology, and they kind of, there's an oversight related to a 1981 essay that Malefi Asante penned with Carrie-Anne Welsh, and it's titled Myth, the Communication Dimension to the African American Mind. And so in closing, there's a lot more I could discuss, but it's been an honor just to share with you how I discovered that exile is a memory phenomenon between merging, my early work and my most recent work. Thank you very much, and I look forward to questions.
Super. Thank you very much, Dr. Temple. Thank you very much.
You're very welcome.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Professor Bongmba. Hello, everyone. I am Daniel Domingues, Associate Professor of History at Rice, and it is my pleasure to moderate the Q&A session. If you have a question, please send it to us by using the Q&A box at the bottom of your screen. Okay, okay. As people type questions there, I will start by shooting one of my own, if you don't mind. Well, it's a terrific topic. I'm fascinated
Thank you.
by it, by your work. Really looking forward to reading your latest book. But when we, well, as I mentioned earlier, I'm a historian, so I'm curious if you could put a little bit this formation of the Black mythology into a historical perspective. When do you see it taking shape?
Yes, that's interesting because it's difficult to list a periodization. So in the broad reading that we do, say in Africana studies, in our approach to Black consciousness, to Black sociopolitical thought, we're reading Fanon, we're reading Nkrumah, we're reading Edward Glissant, and I think there might be some even parallels to Créolité in this as well. And so it's not cherry picking, which is a word that my reviewers used earlier, but it's more a James Baldwin-esque approach to beginning with an essay of ideas. And so we could, at one point I thought, is this a type of project that would be more suitable for like a book of quotations about myth and memory and heroics? And so it's really difficult to do. But if I were to historicize it, which I do on the last chapter called Imaginary Rights, we really start with David Walker's appeal. And so I look so not only do we have that as an historical document, where he identifies anti-heroics, which is a category I didn't mention yet because that needs to be unpacked more. He identifies the enemy of African people, enslaved African people, which can also include Blacks, but he also mentions the Haitian Revolution and some of the other some of the revolts that have happened up to 1829. And so David Walker's appeal would kind of be this first document. We also see though, so in the abolitionist period, that would be kind of our start in this, in a historical sense. We see Henry Highland Garnett's essay on address to, to the colored citizens. The convention, his address, he mentions the Haitian Revolution and he lists Madison, Washington, and he lists Joseph Sankey. He lists our heroes. And so that's really a foundation of this when we look at Black cultural mythology as being part of being attentive to our culture's hero dynamic. And also with the Haitian Revolution, that exists in our time, but it exists more in the early 20th century as we view how writers and the Harlem Renaissance writers would be a great start, really cut their teeth on writing from a heroic that they viewed as part of their cultural inheritance, and that was Haiti. And so you had African American writers who cut their teeth on writing some sort of tale or play or poem or short story about this cultural heroic. And so that would be where I would start with this phenomenon. And it kind of jumps, there's something that happens in the middle, kind of what in the indignant generation, but until Malcolm X's assassination, that's when it really ferments, that you can see the African American community coming together, behaving in a very African way, doing a virtual funeral dirge to Malcolm X. And so that process is really emboldened and fortified by works such as the collection of poetry To Malcolm. It's called To Malcolm, but it's edited by Dudley Randall and Margaret Burroughs. As they said, look at all this outpouring of memorial and acknowledging and warrior kind of praise poetry to Malcolm X. And so those would be, I think I gave you three, I gave you four. David Walker, the Harlem Renaissance, those writers, Henry Highland Garnett before, and then being really cemented with Malcolm X. And so we can look to the future and see what happens with Obama, with those memories. And we've always had quite a few texts on that. So it's not parallel based on the periodizations of history, but we can kind of trace it in a chronological way. Thank you for that question.
Oh, thank you. Thank you. No, I see that you want to move to the future already. But I would like to explore this background a little bit further, and maybe just get your reaction. Well, all these authors, they date from, of course, the 20th century, beginning in the 20th century and moving to the 1960s. But you refer to the Haitian Revolution, which is a late 18th century event. So would you consider that event as the sparkle for the formation of a Black mythology?
I would, that it's a reference point. And so you say when that event happens, when did Black people start writing about it? And have concerns of literacy, what are the early texts when African people could actually write about it? But if we view literature in a broader sense in terms of our oral tradition and heroics, absolutely. So when I did the timeline for the book and you have the blurbs, I think I subtracted from 1791 to the present to really say that we have 2.5 centuries worth of idea formation about diaspora heroics. Yeah. Well, thank you very much. You're very welcome. And it seems to me that even if later authors, right, draw inspiration from the Haitian Revolution, that doesn't necessarily mean that they can't go further back in the past, right, and select important moments and experiences to continue building the mythology. Absolutely. And even Gail Jones in her work, Corregidora, and there's also an epic poem she has. She writes about it. It doesn't fit in the book in that same way. It deserves a mention, and so I discuss it, but she doesn't become one of the major texts. But she goes back to Brazil, to Palmares Maroon Society. And so we see all of these markers where self-emancipation and that prowess toward freedom in its many iterations is important to Black cultural mythology. So
I think it's safe to say that the mythology is expandable, right?
Yes, it definitely is expandable. And speaking of that, I just published, I guess it's online first. I just published an article on Africana cultural memory in the Afro-European context. And so I have some markers for memory idea formation in Germany and Italy and Spain and France, but I really focus on the Black British project. And I found some new variables, including the type of nostalgia that where they actually have a home. And so some of the foundations are different. And so the conceptual framework is malleable. It can be applied, and there's room for categories to be adjusted, added, and amended to account for the specific experiences of other diaspora groups.
Very interesting.
Thank you.
Would you consider the mythology a universe?
Would I consider, I'm a Marvel fan, so you say that, my mind goes into, would I consider the mythology a universe? Actually, I would. And, I say that because I attended the, in my last book, Transcendence in the Africana Literary Enterprise, I have a chapter on Malcolm X and Dr. John Henrik Clarke, who is a journalist and a writer and a father, kind of godfather of Black studies. I have a copy of Dr. Clarke's funeral program. And so we know in his youth, he was the author of that short story, I think in the 50s, called The Boy Who Painted Christ Black, a really popular story. But in his self eulogy that he wrote for his own funeral program, he says, okay, I love my wife, I love my children, blah, blah, blah. He says, I'm approaching heaven's gates. Jesus is there. He has Kwame Nkrumah on one side, and I think it's W.E. Du Bois on the other. And he says, by the way, Jesus is Black. To go out with that as your self-eulogy to create a vision, which part of Black cultural mythology has been that a lot of our heroes have been assassinated. They've died, they've been martyrs. And so they're having a life after that reinforces the African cyclical view of existence made up of those who are here, those who have gone on before, and those who are yet to be born. And so there's this belief, this kind of merged African and Black religious belief that our ancestors are interceding on our behalf. And so I would definitely, in a cosmological sense, call that a universe. What a fantastic question. Thank you.
Okay, excellent. Well, I'm going to go back to Marvel in a little bit, but before I have a question about Alex Haley's Roots.
Mm-hmm.
So that book was, I think it's safe to say, a landmark in American literature. And I don't know if people here express a yearning for Africa because of the book, or if he captured that yearning and discussed in his book, right?
Yes.
It feels to me that it shaped a generation of writers, and I think writers in Africa also picked that up, right?
Yes.
So, but I sense, and based on your presentation, the Black mythology, right, or the diasporan experience. I'm thinking here, for example, of Saadia Hartman talking about the Middle Passage tribe, right? Do you think this is is it right, or does it make sense? Is this happening in your perspective? And if so, why?
Okay, and so when we look at, for example, Maya Angelou's All God's Children in Traveling Shoes, at no point did she say that, I went to the archives of, I forget her, St. Louis. I went to the archives in the South to find out where my ancestors were from. I went to the plantation records. She didn't say that. She didn't say I took a 23andMe or Ancestry.com DNA test, which I've done with my parents. And my dad came back 43% Nigerian. I came back 27% Nigerian. The legacy takes us to Liberia and then Cote d'Ivoire. And so prior to this, I think with the fervor that while African countries were, as some of the writers say, intoxicated with their new independence, while Kwame Nkrumah invited diasporans to come, and we said, oh, it's open, let's go see, that the return, actual physical travel back was one way to kind of answer this question about genealogically speaking, in terms of ancestry, who am I? Will they recognize me? And Maya Angelou writes that physical recognition into her text, that just by merely looking at her face, they can say, you know, you are part of the God people. We are convinced you're tall, you have this, you know, you have these facial features. But it's also, I remember viewing Roots when I was young. And so I was a child. We just moved to the county. I lived in the city. We were bused. We had some really radical civil rights, Black activist type teachers. I remember our music and our PE teachers. And we had one white student on the bus. And so we were bused from our kind of, you know, lower middle class suburb to the project community to go to school. We moved to the county. I saw Roots, and it wasn't about lineage. It was about this narrative that gets glossed over in the Harriet Tubman juvenile books, that you hear about slavery, but you don't know exactly what it means. And then you watch Kunta Kinte being beaten until his name is turned to Toby. And it really fires up a type of Black nationalism that says, oh, no, I'm going to be a Black studies professor. I'm going to get to the bottom of this. I'm going to make sure that we know this story. And unlike me being in the 4th grade crying, you know, just this dramatic crying because it hurts so bad to see that there has to be another way for us to reconcile that history that does not take us into this deep pit of trauma from which we cannot emerge. And so when I read Saadia Hartman's work, I see her trying to process that. I see the other scholars who are working on cultural memory trying to process the trauma and the amnesia, but it just, without being identified as a standalone kind of subfield, we're not working on those answers collectively. And so that's why I find it so important that we look at how we survived all of this. And so it's, I know I gave a lot of answers to your question, but again, wonderful questions. I'm gonna keep these in my file for what some of the next articles and publications can be. Thank you.
Super, well, thank you. Professor Bongmba has a question.
Thank you so much, Professor Temple, for a wonderful presentation.
Very welcome.
Question, I wonder if you could connect, I think in your work, Black cultural mythology, it is when you get to Richard Wright's Native Son that you actually bring in contemporary things about Trayvon Martin, Michael Brown, and so forth. You know, maybe just say a little. Some may know, but maybe others in the audience may want to see how you move up to that point, and when you hit Richard Wright as native, and then you are able to make those contemporary connections.
Absolutely. And so this question has come up in my research quite a bit. And so do you call Emmett Till a hero? Do you call Trayvon Martin a hero? Do you call, you know, Michael Brown a hero? Do you call Sandra Bland a hero? And so we have martyrs and we have heroes. And so it's just something we have to grapple with, that we have people who involuntarily end up being drawn in a struggle as a very prominent figure based on the racism and based on them losing their lives, that is equivalent to the assassinations of our heroes. And so we recognize these losses, we recognize the forces, the anti-heroic oppression that has caused and been responsible for this loss of life. But in Native Son, I find that I ask my students, how many of you have read Native Son? And they act like, that old book, you know, I haven't read that. And even when I asked in class this week, because I'm teaching Black cultural mythology, one student didn't know she read it until I re-narrated the story. And so my concern is finding ways to keep Native Son contemporary. It's a profound story. Every several summers, I reread it. It's so long, it's difficult to teach in class. But Bigger Thomas is this mythoform. He's a form of myth. He exists very much in the folkloric traditions. And so in that chapter, I wanted to show Richard Wright's idea of formation about viewing kind of African-American folklore and folk narratives and folk traditions, and how he embodied his Bigger with these different types of really like Bad Johns, of these different types of Biggers that he saw in his community who were bucking the system. And so I think, and I want our students not reading it, I wanted to kind of revive it a little bit, but I also wanted to talk about the heroic elements in Bigger Thomas. And luckily, he's symbolic as a fictive creation, although he does embody a lot of the kind of defeated dreams. He wanted to be a pilot in the beginning. And if he was allowed to be a pilot, he wouldn't end up on death row. wouldn't end up in the electric chair in this sense. And so it relates a bit to what Amos Wilson talks about, the frustrations in the Black household, when because of poverty, environmental racism, hunger, lack of education, that our children do not get what they need to survive. And so Amos Wilson presents it this way. He says, look, and his book was written in the 80s. He says, at some point, all of the little boys are going to be on the playground and they're going to be vying for personality and to see who's going to be alpha male. And they're going to say, let's play superheroes. And then someone's going to say, I want to be Spider-Man. I want to be Superman. I want to be Aquaman, whatever. And then when there comes to a contest where a Black child and white child both want to be Superman, that contest is going to be solved when the white child says, well, Superman's white. And so what will our Black child do in that encounter, in other symbolic encounters? And it even becomes Bigger Thomas. You can't be a pilot because pilots are white. And so I wanted to give a sense that let's not avoid Native son because it's painful to watch Bigger's mother and younger brother cry for him when he's being sentenced and executed. Let's not look at him like some crazy Negro, but let's understand that he got empowered, but there are better ways to be empowered. And it's a way of giving contemporary life to a profound story that's been brilliant all along. Thank you for your question.
Thank you very much.
All right. Well, moving from DC back to Marvel then. And for those who haven't watched yet, spoiler alert, okay? Eric Killmonger dies at the end of King T'Challa, like Black Panther. And he asks to be buried at the bottom of the sea. Right.
Yes.
How do you, how would you situate that? I mean, I think for younger generation, that was very impactful image, right? Which I think it takes again moves in that direction of let's give Africa a moment and let's focus on our own experiences, building our own mythology, right?
Mm-hmm.
Our own universe. So do you, I don't want to put words in your mouth, but do you concur with this vision? And if you do, I would like to ask you to talk a little bit about what's next.
Okay, well, so this, I don't concur with the vision, but I believe in kind of 101. We have to start somewhere. And so I by comparison, I will introduce the film Harriet, okay? And my students had to write on both of these. So my problem with Harriet Tubman was that when I teach and write about Harriet Tubman in my book, is that I want us to understand that Harriet Tubman had a photo, when we assess, take inventory of her hero dynamic. It's not that she just happened to not get caught and everything else. And so we're talking about, she has hearing like Spider-Man, that she has vision like Superman, like superhero, that she has a photographic memory, that she can stand on top of a mountain and look at the lay of the land and understand the trees and know where the food and berries are going to be. And when she's down in the middle beneath all those trees, she knows the route because she has this extra Harriet sense. And so that's what I wanted to see in the movie, rather than her looking timid and fearful and afraid. And so when we get to Killmonger, I thought that was a really facile, a very easy ending. And it's like, who is that for? Because we actually are more advanced and we're more mature now about understanding our heroes. So I'm thinking, okay, Wakanda, if this is what you can do with Vision by taking that stone out of his head, then why can't you engage in medical breakthroughs to help mental illness? In this case, it is the narcissist in Killmonger. And so I want us to talk about the medicine. I want to talk about how the cousins can get together, how there can be a true sense of Pan-Africanism and reconciliation, because reconciliation has been the challenge all along, that we don't have to leave hating each other and I'm going to go to my grave because I don't want to be in your prison, because Wakanda, based on the technology and wisdom they have, they shouldn't even have prisons. They should have something that actually is able to medically, scientifically rehabilitate. And so I wanted to see a different ending. And I thought they could put him in stasis. I mean, shoot, Captain America was in stasis by accident, you know? And then you've got all this technology and can do it on purpose, you know, deliberately. And so I thought it was a missed opportunity for the Africana Studies category of health science and technology to really do something dynamic.
Super. Thank you. Thank you very much. We really
You're welcome.
appreciate it. I think we already took a lot of your time. So, well, thank you, Dr. Temple. Dr. Christel Temple is Professor of African Studies at the University of Pittsburgh. Next, how should we decide who deserves public honor and memorialization status? That's a discussion with Sanford Levinson next Wednesday, April 13th at 4 p.m. Central. Segregated Houston, Black Life Beyond the Hedges with Frank Guridi and Tiina Steptoe. April 14th at 6 p.m. Central. If you want more details about these events, please check our webpage, caaas.rice.edu. I'd like to thank our co-sponsors, the School of Humanities and the School of Social Science. Thank you, Dr. Elias Bongmba, for joining us today. Thanks for our crew behind the scenes, Eric Granquist, John Waterhouse, and thank you, our audience, for joining us today. On behalf of CAAS, I wish you a very good evening. Thank you.
Thank you.